They won't stop following me.
Get out of my sight right now!
She was just a broke diner waitress working the graveyard shift. He was a patched Hell's Angel covered in scars. When a relentless stalker pushed her to the brink, she whispered 5 desperate words to the terrifying biker. What this outlaw did next left the entire town absolutely speechless. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner flickered a sickly, humming red against the pitch-black sky of Interstate 40. It was a desolate stretch of highway just outside of Barstow, California, a place where tired truckers, drifters, and ghosts stopped for cheap coffee and stale cherry pie. For 23-year-old Charlotte Jenkins, it was the only lifeline she had left. Drowning in her late father's medical debts and facing a ruthless landlord who counted the days until the first of the month, Charlotte had begged her manager for the graveyard shift. The hours between midnight and 6 in the morning paid a premium, and the tips from weary, generous truckers usually made the sleep deprivation worth it. But over the last 3 weeks, the diner had transformed from her sanctuary into a suffocating, terrifying trap. It started on a Tuesday. The bell above the door had chimed at exactly 2:14 a.m. A man walked in, shaking the desert dust off a beige windbreaker. He looked entirely unremarkable. Mid-40s, thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of pale, forgettable face that blended into any crowd. His name was Andrew. Charlotte wouldn't learn his name until it was far too late. That first night, he sat in booth number 4, right by the window. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of pecan pie. When Charlotte brought him his check, he smiled a tight, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his cold, unblinking gray eyes. He left a $20 tip on a $5 bill. Charlotte thought it was a blessing. She was wrong. The next night, he was back at 2:14 a.m. Same booth, same order. This time, when she poured his coffee, he asked about her shift. He asked about her car, the rusted blue Honda Civic parked under the solitary, flickering streetlight outside. He asked if she lived alone. Charlotte, armed with the defensive politeness of a seasoned waitress, gave vague, polite answers and quickly retreated to the safety of the kitchen. By the end of the first week, Andrew wasn't just a regular. He was a fixture. He began staying for her entire shift. He would sit in booth 4, barely touching his cold coffee, his eyes tracking her every single movement. He watched her wipe down counters. He watched her cash out the register. And worst of all, he watched her walk to her car in the suffocating darkness of 6 a.m. The fear began as a slow, creeping chill, but it soon escalated into blinding panic. One morning, after a grueling shift, Charlotte walked out to her Honda to find a folded napkin wedged under her windshield wiper. Written in perfectly neat, blue ink were the words, "You look so beautiful when you're tired. Drive safe. I'll be right behind you." She had sped all the way to her small apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs, constantly checking her rearview mirror. There, 2 cars back, was a gray sedan. It followed her off the highway, through the residential streets, and only turned away when she pulled into her complex. Charlotte went to the police. She sat in a sterile precinct room across from a tired desk sergeant, presenting the napkin and explaining the gray sedan. The officer had sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, miss, I get that you're spooked, but sitting in a diner isn't a crime. Leaving a napkin on a car isn't a crime. Unless he threatens you with physical violence or tries to break into your home, there is nothing we can legally do. Just park in well-lit areas. Get some pepper spray." She was entirely on her own. By the 3rd week, the stalking had become psychological torture. Andrew knew her schedule better than she did. He started showing up at her local grocery store, standing 2 aisles over just watching her pick out cereal. He would park his gray sedan across the street from her apartment building for hours, the glowing cherry of his cigarette the only sign he was inside. But the diner was his main stage. He wanted her to know that there was nowhere she could go, nowhere she could hide, where he couldn't reach her. He had begun leaving objects on the table for her to find. A matchbook from a bar near her apartment, a clipping from a magazine showing a couple holding hands, a single, dead rose. Charlotte was falling apart. She had lost 10 pounds. Her eyes were ringed with dark, exhausted circles, and her hands shook perpetually. She jumped at every sound. Her manager, a gruff man named Bill, was oblivious, usually sleeping in the back office during her shift. She couldn't quit if she lost this job. She'd be homeless in a week. Andrew knew that. He knew she was trapped in that diner, forced to serve him, forced to smile, forced to endure his relentless, predatory gaze. It was a sick, twisted game of cat and mouse, and Andrew was savoring every second of the hunt. He was waiting for her to break, and on a stormy Thursday night in late October, he finally decided to make his move. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets, hammering against the tin roof of the Starlight Diner with a deafening roar. It was 1:45 a.m. The highway was completely washed out, devoid of any passing headlights. The diner was empty, save for Charlotte, the sleeping manager in the back, and Andrew. He was in booth 4. Tonight, however, the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just watching her passively. There was an agitated energy radiating from him. He kept drumming his fingers on the formica table, his gray eyes locked onto her with a new, dark intensity. Charlotte stood behind the counter, clutching a damp rag, her knuckles turning white. Her shift ended at 3 a.m. tonight. For the first time, Andrew had parked his gray sedan not in the distant corner of the lot, but right next to her driver's side door. He was boxing her in. At 2:10 a.m., Andrew stood up. He didn't walk to the register. Instead, he slowly walked toward the back hallway, where the restrooms and the employee break area were located. Charlotte's blood ran cold. She was supposed to do a restroom check every hour. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was waiting for her in the blind spot of the security cameras. She stood frozen behind the counter, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at the phone on the wall. "Call the police!" her brain screamed. But call them for what? A customer walking to the bathroom? They would laugh her off the line again. She was utterly defenseless. Suddenly, the low, distant hum of the storm was pierced by a sound that made the floorboards vibrate. It started as a deep, guttural growl, echoing through the heavy rain, growing louder and more ferocious by the second. The diner's windows rattled in their frames. Headlights cut through the torrential downpour, sweeping across the dark parking lot. Not one, not two, but 6 massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared into the lot. The riders revved their engines, a synchronized, thunderous symphony that drowned out the storm, before cutting the ignitions. Through the rain-streaked windows, Charlotte watched as 6 massive figures dismounted. They wore heavy leather jackets, rain slicking off the material. As they walked toward the diner's entrance, the neon light caught the unmistakable patches on their backs. The winged death's head, the curved top rocker, Hells, Angels, California. The bell above the door chimed wildly as they pushed inside, bringing a gust of freezing wind and the heavy scent of exhaust, rain, and wet leather. They were giants of men. The leader, a towering figure who had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, looked like he was carved from granite. His face was weathered, framed by a thick salt and pepper beard, and a long, jagged scar ran down the left side of his neck, disappearing into his collar. His leather cut bore the patch President. This was Rick Collins. Behind him were 5 others, equally imposing. Tattoos snaked up their necks and covered their knuckles. Heavy silver rings clinked against the tables as they took over the largest booth in the center of the diner, right in the open. Normally, a lone waitress on a graveyard shift might be terrified by the sudden arrival of a notorious outlaw motorcycle club. But in that specific moment, as the bikers filled the room with their massive presence, their deep, booming voices, and their raucous laughter, Charlotte felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. An overwhelming wave of relief. The silence of the diner was broken. The suffocating intimacy of being alone with Andrew was shattered. Rick, the giant with the scarred neck, caught her eye. He didn't sneer or look at her with the predatory gaze she was so used to from Andrew. He gave a firm, polite nod. "Evening, darlin'," his voice rumbled, deep and resonant. "Hope you don't mind us dragging a little of the storm in here. We need 6 black coffees and whatever meat you got left in the kitchen." "Right away, sir," Charlotte managed to say, her voice trembling, though this time not entirely from fear. She grabbed 3 pots of coffee and a stack of heavy ceramic mugs, her hands shaking slightly as she walked over to the biker's table. As she poured the coffee, she could feel the sheer, raw power radiating from the men. They joked with each other, ignoring the rest of the room, speaking in a shorthand language of brotherhood and the road. "Take your time, sweetheart," one of the bikers, a man with a bald head and a patch that read Sergeant at Arms, said gently, as a drop of coffee spilled onto the table from Charlotte's shaking pot. "We ain't in a rush." "Thank you," she whispered. As she turned back toward the counter, her heart stopped. Andrew had emerged from the back hallway. He was furious. His face, usually a mask of chilling blankness, was contorted into a scowl of pure, unadulterated rage. His private stage had been invaded. His perfect plan for the night had been ruined by the arrival of the bikers. He marched over to his booth 4 and aggressively threw a $10 bill on the table. He didn't sit back down. Instead, he walked directly toward the counter, stepping directly into Charlotte's path as she tried to return to the kitchen. "You didn't check the restrooms," Andrew hissed, his voice low, meant only for her ears. The smell of stale peppermints and old coffee washed over her face. I have other customers," Charlotte stammered, taking a step back until her spine hit the edge of the pie display case. Andrew took a step forward, completely closing the distance between them. He reached out, his cold, clammy fingers wrapping tightly around her left wrist. His grip was like a vice, digging into her skin. "Your shift ends in 45 minutes, Charlotte. You're going to walk out to your car, and I'm going to be right there. Don't think these trashy bikers are going to save you. They'll be gone soon." Tears pricked the corners of Charlotte's eyes. Panic seized her throat. She tried to yank her arm away, but he held fast, his thumb pressing painfully into her vein. She looked past his shoulder. At the large center booth, the laughter had stopped. Rick Collins, the towering president of the chapter, was holding his coffee mug halfway to his mouth. His dark, piercing eyes were locked dead onto the counter. He had seen the grab. He had seen the panic on Charlotte's face. Andrew, oblivious to the sudden deadly silence that had fallen over the center of the diner, finally let go of her wrist with a violent shove and turned toward the door. He walked out into the pouring rain, intending to wait in his car, parked right next to hers. Charlotte stood frozen, rubbing her bruised wrist, a stray tear escaping and rolling down her pale cheek. She was shaking so violently she could barely stand. In 45 minutes, she would have to walk out into the dark. Slowly, the heavy scrape of a chair echoed through the diner. Rick stood up. At 6'5" and nearly 300 pounds of muscle and leather, he moved with terrifying, deliberate silence. He walked over to the counter, dwarfing it. He looked down at Charlotte, his eyes dropping briefly to her red, bruised wrist, and then back up to her terrified, tear-filled eyes. The rough, scarred outlaw leaned forward over the counter. His voice was incredibly quiet, completely contrasting his massive frame. "Miss," Rick rumbled softly, "do you know that man?" Charlotte looked up at the giant. She looked at the death's head patch on his chest. She thought about the police who did nothing. She thought about the napkin. She thought about the gray sedan waiting outside in the dark. She took a ragged breath, the dam finally breaking. She leaned closer across the counter, and with a voice barely above a desperate breath, she whispered to the Hell's Angel, "He won't stop following me." Rick didn't blink. He didn't ask her for proof. He didn't tell her it wasn't a crime. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek. The scar on his neck seemed to pull taut. He looked back at his table, where 5 hardened bikers were watching him, waiting for a signal. Rick gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. What happened next would become a local legend, whispered about in Barstow for years to come. The single nod from Rick Collins was the only command needed. The shift in the diner's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. To an untrained eye, nothing had changed. The 5 men at the center booth didn't jump up, they didn't pull weapons, and they didn't shout. But the raucous laughter died completely. The casual, relaxed posture of the men vanished, replaced by a rigid, coiled tension. They were no longer patrons seeking shelter from a storm. They were a pack of wolves that had just locked onto a scent. Rick turned his attention back to Charlotte. His massive, calloused hand reached out and gently pushed the heavy ceramic mug toward her. "Pour me a warm-up," "Darlin'," Rick said, his voice a low, steady rumble that completely masked the violence in his eyes. "And then I want you to go into the kitchen, find your manager, and tell him you're taking a 15-minute break. You stay out of sight until the clock strikes 3. You understand?" Charlotte could only nod, her hands shaking so violently she spilled hot coffee over the rim of the mug. She placed the pot down, backed away from the counter, and practically sprinted into the safety of the swinging kitchen doors. Out in the parking lot, the torrential rain continued to batter the asphalt. Andrew sat inside his gray sedan, the engine idling, the heater blasting. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. He stared through the sweeping wiper blades at the neon diner sign, his chest heaving with indignant rage. How dare she? How dare she look at those filthy, degenerate bikers like they were her saviors? He had spent weeks studying her, learning her, planning this exact night. Tonight was the night he was finally going to take her away from this pathetic, dead-end life. He had prepared everything, and now, these tattooed thugs were delaying his schedule. Andrew glanced at the digital clock on his dashboard. 2:45 a.m. 15 minutes. They would leave soon. Bikers always moved on. He just had to wait them out. He reached into his windbreaker pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, hard steel of the heavy tactical knife he had bought 3 days ago. The metallic touch calmed his racing heart. Inside the diner, Rick threw a crumpled $50 bill onto the table. "Keep the change," he told the empty counter. The 6 Hells Angels stood up in unison. The heavy scrape of their boots against the linoleum floor sounded like a military cadence. They zipped up their leather cuts over their jackets, pulled on heavy riding gloves, and pushed through the double glass doors, stepping out into the freezing, driving rain. From his car, Andrew watched them emerge. Finally, he thought, a cruel smile twisting his thin lips. "Get on your obnoxious toys and get out of my way." He watched as the massive men swung their legs over the saddles of their customized Harley-Davidsons. The engines roared to life, a deafening, mechanical thunder that overpowered the storm. Headlights cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating the dark, flooded lot. Andrew put his car into gear, ready to move into the spot, right next to the diner's exit, the second they vacated the area. But the Hells Angels didn't head for the highway. Instead, the first biker, the bald sergeant-at-arms named Smitty, pulled his massive road glide forward and stopped it directly in front of Andrew's front bumper, blocking his path forward. Andrew blinked, his cruel smile faltering. He reached for his horn, ready to honk, when a second bike flanked his driver's side door, stopping mere inches from the metal. A third bike pulled up tight against his passenger side. Within 10 seconds, Andrew's gray sedan was entirely caged in a perimeter of roaring American steel. 6 massive motorcycles surrounded him, their blinding high beams shining directly into his windows, illuminating the interior of his car like an interrogation room. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Andrew's delusion. He slammed his hand against the door lock button, making sure it was engaged. He threw the car into reverse, desperately looking over his shoulder. But 2 more bikes were staggered perfectly behind him, blocking any chance of escape. He was trapped. The deafening roar of the 6 engines was suddenly cut off, one by one. The sudden silence that followed, save for the drumming rain, was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Rick Collins dismounted his bike, parked right next to Andrew's driver's side door. The towering president didn't rush. He slowly walked through the rain, the water slicking off his leather vest, highlighting the winged death's head on his back. He stepped right up to Andrew's window. Andrew scrambled backward over the center console, pressing his back against the passenger seat, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. The predator had suddenly, violently, become the prey. Rick raised a heavy, silver-ringed fist and tapped 3 times on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. "Roll it down," Rick commanded. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a deep, gravelly order that vibrated right through the wet glass. Andrew shook his head frantically, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "I'll call the cops," he screamed, his voice cracking, though he knew the sound couldn't penetrate the heavy glass and the storm. Rick sighed, a puff of white breath escaping his lips in the cold air. He didn't ask twice. He looked over at Smitty. Smitty reached into the heavy saddlebag of his motorcycle. He didn't pull out a gun. He didn't pull out a bat. He pulled out a heavy, industrial-grade steel spring punch, a tool used to shatter car windows instantly in emergencies. Smitty pressed the small metal tip against the rear driver's side window. Click. The tempered glass exploded inward with a sharp crack, showering the back seat in thousands of sparkling diamond-like shards. The freezing storm immediately whipped into the car, carrying the smell of wet leather and exhaust. Andrew shrieked, covering his head with his arms. Rick reached his massive arm through the shattered rear window, calmly unlocked the driver's side door from the inside, and pulled the handle. He wrenched the door open so violently, the hinges screamed in protest. The storm was now fully inside the car, and so was the towering president of the Hells Angels. "Get out," Rick said. "You can't do this. This is assault. This is kidnapping." Andrew shrieked, pressing himself as far into the passenger side as humanly possible, his wire-rimmed glasses askew on his pale, sweating face. "I ain't touching you," Rick replied calmly, leaning into the open doorway, his massive frame blocking out the parking lot lights. "I'm just a concerned citizen checking on a vehicle in distress. Now, step out of the car, or my sergeant-at-arms is going to physically remove you through the windshield." Andrew looked past Rick. Smitty was standing there in the rain, cracking his tattooed knuckles, a terrifying grin on his face. Behind him, the other four angels stood like silent sentinels, watching the highway for any passing cars. Trembling uncontrollably, his bladder betraying him slightly, Andrew crawled back over the center console and stepped out into the freezing rain. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed back against the side of his car. "What do you want?" Andrew sobbed, wiping rain and snot from his face. "I didn't do anything. I'm just drinking coffee." "We know exactly what you're doing," Rick said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly lethal. "You've been terrorizing that girl inside. You think because she's serving pie at 2 in the morning, she ain't got nobody looking out for her? You think she's just a stray animal you can corner? She likes me!" Andrew spat desperately, his twisted delusion momentarily overpowering his fear. "We have a connection. You're ruining it." Rick didn't punch him. A punch would leave a mark. A punch could be photographed for a police report. These men were professionals. They knew how to dismantle a man without ever throwing a right hook. "Smitty," Rick said, not taking his eyes off Andrew. "Check the trunk. Check the back seat. Let's see what kind of connection this gentleman is fostering." Andrew's face drained of all remaining color. "No, you can't search my car. That's illegal." Smitty ignored him, leaning through the shattered rear window. He grabbed a heavy black duffel bag sitting on the floorboards, pulling it out into the rain. He unzipped it and dumped the contents right onto the wet asphalt at Rick's feet. The Hells Angels looked down at the puddle. Out of the bag tumbled a roll of heavy silver duct tape, a package of heavy-duty industrial zip ties, a bottle of chloroform, rags, a terrifyingly large hunting knife, and a stack of printed, grainy photographs. Rick picked up one of the wet photos. It was a picture of Charlotte, but not at the diner. It was a picture of her walking into her apartment complex. It was taken from the bushes. The air in the parking lot seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The angels didn't speak, but the shift in their posture was deadly. This was no longer just a creep with a crush. This was a thwarted abduction. Andrew had planned to take her tonight. Rick slowly lifted his eyes from the photo and locked them onto Andrew. Andrew was practically vibrating with terror, tears streaming down his face. "You're a monster," Rick stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was a statement of pure, undeniable fact. Rick reached into the front seat of Andrew's car, snatching the keys from the ignition. He then reached into Andrew's windbreaker pocket, pulling out his leather wallet. "Hey!" Andrew yelped, trying to grab it back. But Smitty took one step forward, and Andrew shrank back against the wet metal of his car. Rick opened the wallet, pulled out Andrew's driver's license, and held it up to the light of a motorcycle headlamp. "Andrew Pendleton," Rick read aloud, committing the name to memory. 442, Sycamore Drive, Apartment 3, B, San Bernardino. Rick looked back at Andrew. "Here's how this is going to work, Andrew. You're going to get back in this vehicle. You are going to drive away from this diner. If I ever see your face in Barstow again, if you ever look at that diner again, if you ever even think the name Charlotte again, Rick stepped closer, towering over the cowering man, his scarred neck visible in the neon light. "I have your address, Andrew. My brothers have your address. We have chapters from here to the Mexican border. If you breathe near that girl again, we aren't going to call the cops. We are going to come to 442 Sycamore Drive, and we are going to use everything in this duffel bag on you." Rick took Andrew's driver's license, tucked it into his own leather vest pocket, and threw the wallet into the flooded gutter. He then picked up Andrew's car keys. He snapped the plastic fob in half, rendering the electronic locks useless, and threw the keys into the deep, rushing storm drain at the edge of the parking lot. "You better start walking, Andrew. It's a long way to San Bernardino in the rain." At exactly 3 a.m., the back door of the diner crept open. Charlotte stepped out, clutching her thin jacket around her, holding her breath, terrified of what she would find. She looked toward her rusted Honda Civic. Andrew's gray sedan was gone. The parking space was completely empty, save for a pile of wet, ruined photographs and a roll of duct tape washing away in the rain. Instead, lined up perfectly behind her little Honda, were 6 roaring Harley Davidsons. Rick Collins was leaning against the trunk of her car, smoking a cigarette, ignoring the downpour. When he saw her, he flicked the cigarette away and gave her that same polite nod. "Shift's over, darlin'." Rick rumbled over the sound of the rain and the engines. "Get in. We're giving you an escort home, and don't you worry about that gray car ever again." He decided to relocate. Charlotte fell to her knees on the wet asphalt, burying her face in her hands, and for the first time in almost a month, she sobbed tears of absolute, profound relief. The nightmare was over. The wolves had chased the monster away. The drive back to Charlotte's apartment complex that night was a surreal, thunderous parade. 6 heavy Harley Davidsons flanked her rusted blue Honda Civic in a perfect diamond formation, their high beams cutting through the torrential rain. The deafening roar of the heavy V-twin engines echoed off the sleepy residential streets of Barstow, an undeniable warning to anyone lurking in the shadows. When Charlotte finally pulled into her designated parking spot, she killed the engine, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. She watched through the rain-streaked windshield as the 6 bikers idled in a semicircle around her vehicle. Rick Collins, the towering president of the chapter, gave her a single, sharp nod, gesturing toward her front door. She scrambled out of the car, practically sprinting up the concrete stairs to her second-floor unit. She fumbled with her keys, shoved the deadbolt home, and collapsed against the wooden door. Only when the lights flicked on in her living room did the deafening roar of the motorcycles outside finally fade away, their taillights disappearing into the stormy night. For the first time in almost a month, Charlotte slept a full, unbroken 12 hours. Returning to the Starlight Diner for her next graveyard shift felt like stepping onto a battlefield after the war had ended. She was terrified that the Hells Angels' intimidation tactics had only been a temporary fix. Stalkers like Andrew rarely just walked away. Their obsessions usually fueled violent retaliations. But Booth 4 remained completely empty. Instead, at exactly 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and Smitty, the bald sergeant-at-arms, strolled in. He didn't bring a menacing crew. He sat at the counter, ordered a slice of cherry pie and a black coffee, tipped her a $100 bill, and read a motorcycle magazine until her shift ended. The message was crystal clear. The Angels had established a watch. Charlotte was under their absolute protection. Days turned into a week, and Andrew never showed his face. Charlotte's dark circles began to fade. Her hands stopped shaking, and the crushing weight of paranoia finally lifted from her chest. But the true magnitude of what the Hells Angels had saved her from wouldn't be revealed until a chilly Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after the storm. Charlotte was sitting in her small kitchen, sipping tea and watching the local morning news on a small, static-filled television. The anchor, a polished woman with stiff blonde hair, was breaking a major story out of San Bernardino County. "We begin this morning with a shocking development in a series of cold cases," the anchor announced, her tone grave. Local authorities have apprehended a man now believed to be connected to the disappearances of 3 young women along the Interstate 40 corridor. A mugshot flashed onto the screen. Charlotte dropped her mug. It shattered against the linoleum floor, hot tea splattering her ankles. Staring back at her from the television screen was the pale, forgettable face, thinning brown hair, and cold gray eyes of the man from Booth 4. but the name at the bottom of the screen didn't say Andrew Pendleton. 46-year-old Andrew Hughes was taken into custody late Sunday night, the anchor continued. The arrest came after a highly unusual anonymous tip was hand-delivered to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. According to inside sources, the tip included Hughes's real driver's license, photographs of a new intended victim, and a map leading to an abandoned vehicle in Barstow. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as the broadcast showed B-roll footage of a familiar gray sedan being towed from a storm drain. Its rear driver's side window was completely shattered. Rick hadn't just scared Andrew away. Outlaws lived by a strict, brutal code, and men like Rick Collins despised predators who hunted the defenseless. When Rick took Andrew's wallet that rainy night, he hadn't just thrown it away. He had immediately recognized the signs of a professional, escalating threat. The duffel bag of zip ties, duct tape, and chloroform wasn't a beginner's kit. The news report detailed how deputies, acting on the anonymous tip, raided Hughes's apartment on Sycamore Drive. What they found in his basement shocked even the most hardened detectives. It wasn't just a home, it was a terrifying shrine. They discovered personal items belonging to the 3 missing women, meticulously cataloged, alongside hundreds of surveillance photographs. And right on top of his desk were developed rolls of film, dozens of pictures of the Starlight Diner, the blue Honda Civic, and Charlotte. Hughes had been hunting along the highway for years. He targeted young, isolated women working late-night shifts, women who were entirely alone, women the police wouldn't prioritize. He had meticulously planned to take Charlotte that rainy Thursday night. If the storm hadn't driven the Hells Angels into that specific diner at that specific time, Charlotte would have vanished without a trace, becoming just another tragic face on a missing person poster. Hughes had been apprehended hitchhiking near the Nevada border. The police report noted that he was suffering from mild exposure, completely traumatized, and rambling incoherently about giant wolves destroying his car. Charlotte sank to the floor amidst the shattered porcelain of her mug, covering her mouth as hot tears streamed down her face. The sheer scale of her near miss was paralyzing. 2 nights later, during the quietest hour of the graveyard shift, the diner bell chimed. Charlotte looked up from the register. Rick Collins stepped through the door, his heavy leather cut shifting over his broad shoulders. The jagged scar on his neck stood out in the harsh neon light. He didn't have his crew with him this time. He was completely alone. He walked up to the counter and looked at Charlotte. She looked back at the hardened outlaw, the man society deemed a menace, a criminal, a terror. To her, he was the only reason she was drawing breath. "Coffee, darling?" Rick asked, his deep voice carrying a soft, unspoken understanding. Charlotte didn't say a word. She reached across the counter, completely bypassing the coffee pots, and wrapped her arms as far around the giant biker's leather-clad torso as she could manage. She hugged him with every ounce of strength in her body. Rick stiffened for a fraction of a second, entirely unaccustomed to such open displays of civilian gratitude. Then, slowly, one massive, calloused hand came up and gently patted her shoulder. "You're safe now, kid," Rick rumbled softly. The wolves got him. He left a $100 bill under his coffee saucer and walked back out into the night, the roar of his engine fading into the vast, dark desert, leaving behind a waitress who would never look at a leather vest the same way again. Sometimes the greatest protectors don't wear shining armor. They wear heavy leather and ride on 2 wheels. Charlotte's terrifying ordeal proves that guardian angels can come in the most unexpected and terrifying forms. If this incredible true story of survival and street justice had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life drama.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, poor Waitress whispered to a Hell's Angel, "He won't stop following me." What he did shocked everyone. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the fear and desperation behind such a quiet request for help. The waitress didn't make a scene or ask for attention. She simply trusted someone enough to speak up in a moment when she felt unsafe. I think that's what gave the story its emotional impact. Sometimes, people who look the toughest on the outside end up becoming the strongest source of protection when it truly matters. Do you think the biker reacted the way he did because he'd seen situations like that before? Or because nobody should ever feel alone when they're scared? And why do you think stories about unexpected protectors connect so strongly with audiences? I think stories like this remind us how important it is to pay attention when someone quietly asks for help, and to never ignore signs that someone may be in trouble. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with loyalty, protection, and unexpected human connection, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.